blog, thevirtuoushome.com, and today I want to share with you my basic sourdough guide. To begin, let's talk about what a sourdough starter is. This is my sourdough starter. Basically, a sourdough starter is a mixture of flour and water that sits out at room temperature and accumulates the yeast in your environment, and it ferments the flour and water mixture, or dough, and gives off these gas bubbles, which is what makes bread products rise. So how do you make a sourdough starter? Well, I use the no discard sourdough starter method. I have a whole video on that, as well as a full blog post over on the blog. So let's talk about how I feed my sourdough starter. I feed my sourdough starter with 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. I used to do the no measuring method where you just dump a little flour in, dump a little water, stir it up, make it kind of a thick batter consistency, and call it good. It's not very consistent. You can't count on a consistent result with your recipes if you're not having a consistent sourdough starter. I found it to be super stressful, so I eventually switched to using an equal portion of weight with flour and water every time I feed my sourdough starter, so I don't have to think about it anymore. So I use my sourdough starter. After I use it in a recipe, I feed it right away. I leave it on the counter to ferment for 4 to 6 hours in warmer weather, and more like 6 to 8 or 12 hours in the cooler months of the year. And then once it has fermented and it has risen and it's nice and bubbly like it is here, then I seal it and I stick it in the fridge. Now the fridge will slow down the process and it'll keep it super active for days on end, even up to almost a week. So that way I can pull out my sourdough starter straight from the fridge and use it in any recipe when I'm ready to bake. I don't have to think 6 to 8 hours or the night before I want to make a recipe. I can just go into my kitchen and I can pull out my sourdough starter and make it. Now eventually the sourdough starter will get a little inactive and kind of look deflated and kind of sad. If it goes too long in the fridge, so over 5 to 7 days, I would want to feed it again before I use it in a recipe, just so it's active and super bubbly for the best results in a recipe. Now let's talk about what sourdough discard is. Sourdough discard is when your sourdough starter, it's not nice and bubbly. Now if all of this was inactive, it was not nice and bubbly, and I were to feed it, my jar would overflow. So therefore, I would have to discard some and then feed it. I use the no discard method though, and because I'm constantly using this, I use it almost every other day, I never have to discard anything because I use it, I feed it, I ferment it, it stays in the fridge, and I use it again for another recipe. Now eventually my jar will start getting a little full, and so I make my sourdough discard pancake recipe where it can use as much sourdough discard you have on hand to completely empty your jar and you can start again. That does not mean I start a new sourdough starter from scratch. It just means that I might just have like a little bit, maybe a tablespoon or just some around the sides of the jar, but most of the starter has been used, and so there's lots of space in my jar again and I don't have to discard anything. Now you do not need a jar to make a sourdough starter. You can keep it in a bowl with a lid, whatever you have on hand. I like this quart jar. It's just what works well for me. And then I also use wooden spoons to stir it. Sometimes sourdough starters can react with metal, so I try to keep metal away from my sourdough starter. Now I do use metal bowls when I'm making a recipe and don't have a problem, but for whatever reason, sometimes your sourdough starter itself, it can react and you may not get consistent results if you use metal with your sourdough starter itself. Now let's talk about the tools you need to make a sourdough loaf. I personally like to use a digital scale. You can use measuring cups. Most recipes will offer cup measurements and by weight. I prefer to do by weight because it is most consistent and you have less dishes to wash afterwards. If you use cups, then you have to be cleaning sourdough starter out of your measuring cups or the extra measuring spoons. But with a scale, you just set your mixing bowl on top of it and you put all the ingredients in it and there are no extra dishes to wash. I also prefer the digital scale because I like to make my own fresh milled flour. And to do so, you want a digital scale, because a cup of unmilled wheat is not the same as a cup of flour, but the same amount of grams of wheat is the same amount of grams of flour. So therefore, I choose to use a scale. You'll just need a basic mixing bowl to put your ingredients in. Like I said, you could use metal bowls to make recipes, and you shouldn't have a problem with it reacting. I also use a lot of plastic wrap to cover my bowls. You want to seal your bowl with your dough when you're making bread, just to keep dust and bugs and whatnot out, but also it keeps the air out, so it won't form a film or like a skin on top of your dough. That's all the things you need to make homemade bread with sourdough. Of course, you'll need ingredients like flour, water, salt, and oil. Like I said, I like to use fresh milled flour, but I used organic, unbleached, all-purpose flour from the store. I just got mine at Walmart. Arrowhead brand's a good one. King Arthur's another one. As far as water, I just use a Brita water pitcher to filter my water. I started out using tap water and just random all-purpose flour that was bleached and enriched, and it did not turn out well. I did not get a good, bubbly, active sourdough starter. So I highly recommend at least getting unbleached flour and filtered water of some sort. To bake homemade bread with sourdough, you'll need the basic tools like a loaf pan and some parchment paper. You do not have to use parchment paper, but it can be hard to get loaves out of loaf pans. Even if you grease it and do all the things, sometimes it still sticks, and then all your hard work feels like it goes down the drain because your loaf fell apart, even though it baked and it's delicious, but it just doesn't look pretty because it's stuck in the pan. So I prefer to use parchment paper. I like to wet it and squeeze it out, shake it out. That way it fits into the bread pan a little easier and it's easier to work with. And then for serving your sourdough starter, you'll want at least to have a cutting board and a serrated knife. If you don't have a bread knife on hand when you make your first loaf, a steak knife will work too. And then as far as storing your loaf, I usually just put it in a Ziploc bag and keep it on my countertop. I make bread every other day or so, and we eat a loaf in 24 hours to 48 hours, so it doesn't last long. But if we do go over, say 2 days, and the bread starts to get stale, then I'll make breadcrumbs with it. Another good option that I have not tried yet, but someday probably will, is making croutons. You can also make croutons with your homemade bread. Now, the first day, we usually can just slice into the bread and slather on some butter or some olive oil and enjoy the bread. After about the first day, we like to toast it just for a better texture, and we enjoy it better that way. Now, those are the tools that you need to have on hand to make bread, but there are some things that are nice to have on hand. Now, if you're wanting to make a more artisanal loaf of bread, you'll be using a bread pan. You'll want to have a Dutch oven on hand. Another tool that is nice to have but not a necessity is a banneton or a basket. If you don't have one, that's fine too. You can substitute with a bowl and a tea towel. You just get the tea towel wet to keep the loaf moist, and you put it in your bowl, and then you can put your dough in, and then when it comes time, you can easily just dump it out, and the towel makes sure it comes out nice and easy. That is a good substitute for a banneton basket. If you're a beginner at making sourdough, I highly recommend you start with a sandwich loaf. One reason is because it has less steps than a full artisanal loaf. It won't be so overwhelming because there are less steps. And another reason is that once you master a sandwich loaf, that same recipe, with just a few tweaks, can be changed into a pizza dough or cinnamon rolls or dinner rolls. So that's why I like to recommend that you start with a sandwich loaf, just because it can go so many other directions. Now let's talk about long fermenting sourdough. What is long fermentation? Long fermenting sourdough is when you let your sourdough ferment for about 12 hours before you bake it. This doesn't mean you leave it out at room temperature for 12 hours. Especially in the warmer months, you want to do about 6-ish hours and then stick it in the fridge for the remainder of the time, like another 6 or so hours until you're ready to bake it. Now over the winter when it's colder, you probably can leave it out on the counter for 12 hours just because it's colder and the fermentation process is a lot slower at lower temperatures. The first reason why you'd want to long ferment your sourdough is that the sourdough ferments or breaks down the ingredients in the dough, making it easier to digest. So those who are gluten intolerant or who struggle to process grains can digest sourdough a lot better. The second reason is that long fermenting makes for a lighter and fluffier bread. I often make a same day sourdough bread where I start the loaf the same day and bake it. But honestly, not even my husband liked it that much because it still kind of was crumbly. It was hard to make sandwiches with. It was really good, it tasted fine, but it was just a little crumbly and it was a little more dense. Now when I started long fermenting my sourdough, then the texture was a lot lighter. It was fluffy, almost spongy. It was divine. The third reason is that it's easier to time your baking schedule. So you've probably seen in baking schedules where people are like, oh, you start at 8 and then you do this at this time and this at this time and then you bake it at this time. And honestly, as a busy mom, that can be really stressful. So I like to long ferment my dough, which means I started at nap time when my kids are sleeping so I can focus on my recipe, pay attention, get it done. I let it ferment for 6 hours and then usually after supper time at some point, maybe right before bed, I make sure it's covered with some plastic wrap and I stick it in the fridge until I'm ready to bake it the next day. I don't have to bake it right away. It will continue to rise in the fridge and it will be a perfect loaf of bread, and I do not have to time it perfectly. I can do it when I need to and it works around my schedule. That's the third reason why I like to long ferment bread. Now, if you do not have a mixer, you may have noticed that I did not list a mixer in the tools that you need to make bread. If you don't have a mixer, then your best friend will be stretch and folds. Basically what that means is after you mix all the ingredients together and the flour is incorporated, then you will want to do a series of stretch and folds. So you want to do at least 3, if not 6 stretch and folds. So that means every 20 minutes, you're gonna come back and play with the dough. So you will take the dough at the top of the bowl and you'll kind of pull it up, stretch it. At the first time, it may not stretch because it hasn't started fermenting yet. It may just break, but you just kind of break it and you fold it in half. Then you turn the bowl and you pull it up and you fold it in half. Turn the bowl, stretch it, and you fold it. Turn the bowl and you stretch it and you fold it until you've gone all the way around the bowl, so usually about 4 times. Then you do this every 20 minutes or so for 5 or 6 times. And slowly, each time you come back, you'll notice that the dough stretches a little better. It's a lot easier to work with. It's more fun to play with. And that's how you make bread without a mixer. It's totally possible. I do have a bread machine that I use as my mixer, but I can only make 1 loaf at a time. If I want to make a double batch of bread or make multiple loaves of bread ahead for the whole week because I won't have time to actually make bread, then I can do that by doing stretch and folds with all my loaves. Let's talk about the whole process from start to finish to make a sourdough sandwich loaf. So first you'll take your bowl, you'll add all your ingredients, your flour, your water, your salt, your oil, and then you mix it up. And then you'll cover it and you'll let it set for 30 minutes to an hour. It's not exact. And you let it rest. Now, the fancy term for this is autolyze, where the flour will start to absorb all the liquid. So you let it rest for 30 minutes to an hour, and then you come back and you start doing your stretch and folds. And then you do that every 20 minutes. So the way I keep track of it, I have to set a timer. Some people are like, oh, I don't set a timer. When I remember, I come back and do it. Now, I will forget the entire process if I do not set a timer. So if you have a newer iPhone, you can set 5 or 6 timers to go all at the same time. I just save the same timers on my phone and I can start them all at the same time, so I don't have to remember to restart a timer or anything like that. And then the alarms just go off and I know I need to go play with my dough a little bit and stretch and fold. So then after the stretch and fold, I will shape my dough. And so that's when I shape it. I kind of roll it a little bit and stretch it into the corners of my loaf pan. Again, I use parchment paper in my loaf pan to make it easier to get the loaf out after it bakes. So after you've shaped it, I cover it again with plastic wrap, and it sits on the counter for at least another 2 hours, if not 4 hours, to continue to rise. This is the bulk fermentation or bulk rise time. After it's risen a little bit, even if it just starts the process, may not even have doubled completely, then I will cover it with plastic wrap and I'll stick it in the fridge. And it may go overnight, it may be 1 day, 2 days, 3 days before I actually even bake this bread. But it will slowly continue to ferment and slowly continue to rise in the fridge. And then when I'm ready to bake it, I'll preheat the oven and then I pull it out. Now I do transfer my dough into a second loaf pan so that I'm not putting a super cold loaf pan into the oven, especially if you're using glass pans that could shatter the pan. So I do have a second loaf pan where I transfer my cold dough into a fresh pan that was not sitting in the fridge, and then I bake it in that. Once it comes out of the oven, I usually pull it out using the parchment paper and I set it on a cooling rack. That's the other tool I forgot. You'll want a cooling rack because this will help the dough cool off faster because it gives it better air circulation, and that keeps the bottom of the dough from being doughy or steamy. Sometimes I take it straight out of the parchment paper too and put it on the cooling rack. Sometimes I leave it. Either way, as long as it's on the cooling rack, it will cool great. Now you want to cool your loaf for at least 30 minutes to an hour before eating it. If you go a full hour, it won't be as hot inside. It'll still be a little warm. But if you can't resist the temptation of slicing into a fresh homemade loaf of bread, then you need to wait at least 30 minutes to continue to let most of the steam out. If you cut it right away and don't wait 30 minutes, it will be a little doughy and maybe even gummy, and that's not the texture you're going for. I hope you found this basic sourdough guide helpful. You can let me know if you have any questions. If you found this video helpful, please like or subscribe. You can find all my recipes over on the blog, thevirtuoushome.com. I do have a few YouTube videos up as well on my channel for recipes that I make. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time with more sourdough recipes.